You may be familiar with a term that has cropped up over the last few years, and that is cancel culture. It's a phenomenon where people who ostracize others will be ostracizing others for something that someone said, something that someone did, maybe even decades ago, because it doesn't align with a certain set of beliefs or norms, even if those beliefs or norms are held by a very, very small subset of the population. Well, even though people really have been kicked out of different social aspects, social venues, for really since the beginning of time, this new approach is far more far-reaching, I'll say, because of mass media, because of social media, etc. Now, ultimately, cancel culture is about rejecting a person or a group of people in some way. And again, that is nothing new because rejection itself is nothing new. But it is one thing to be rejected. It is another thing to be one who is rejecting others. And so oftentimes what people will do is they will reject other people before they themselves can be rejected. But here's the problem with all of that. Every single one of us deserves to be rejected by at least some others, but most importantly by God. We all deserve to be rejected by God, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And by falling short of God's glory, we deserve to be rejected. The idea of hurting others before they hurt you, well, God could say, I'm going to hurt you before you hurt me. But He doesn't. Because the opposite of cancel culture is to have a culture of love. Sometimes it's hard for those who feel rejected to consider that they may still be loved by someone, that they may still have a purpose in life somewhere. And that is in part what Paul is addressing here in Romans chapter 11. Whether or not the Jews felt rejected by God before receiving Paul's letter, and certainly some of them would have, by the time they had arrived at reading to this point in the letter, they certainly would have felt rejected by God. But even worse, they would have felt that they had been completely replaced by the Gentiles. However, Paul makes clear that God has not rejected the Jew. In Romans 9, verses 4 and 5, he talks about their heritage, their rich heritage. And he talks about the promises that had been given to the Israelites, who were now Jews, based upon a name change. But they may not feel like God is keeping their promises, and thus they feel rejected. But God has not abandoned them. The reality is that most of the Israelites, most of the Jews, had actually abandoned God. Now, the reality to that is that it is nothing new that people have abandoned God. God established the nation and thus established Himself as the leader over Israel. But after Joshua, the time of Joshua, the people rebelled and they would follow their own ways. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We see that in the book of Judges time and time again, where they would go off on their own and then they would cry out to God for deliverance. It happened over and over. And then we get to 1 Samuel. And the people demand a king that they can see. God had set Himself up as their king as He called the nation together. But now they wanted a king that they could see, that they could touch, that they could hear, that they could feel. And so Samuel was appointed as their leader. But even then, even though they betrayed God, God did not abandon them. Over the centuries, the people continued to rebel and to forget who God was, and then they would have something happen and they would turn back to God until they didn't any longer. And we see that happening first with the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes in the northern part of Israel that were eventually taken captive by Assyria and never to ultimately return as a people. We saw it 150 years later when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem and took the remaining tribes of Judah and Benjamin and And all of these people of Israel had rejected God, even through all of that. And even though they had been taken into captivity, God never rejected them, as seen because He brought many of them back home. And now we get to Paul's day, and the people were distant from God once again, and many of them had wondered if God would keep His promises, if God had any morals to Him to keep His promises, or if indeed God had rejected them over time. And Paul says assuredly that God has not ultimately rejected His people. However, as has been the pattern throughout time, they would have to turn back to God in faith. The truth is that in some form, cancel culture has always existed. Not just between people, not just between groups of people, but between people and God. But even though many of us, and actually, let me say that differently, even though any of us may at times seek to cancel God, He will not seek to cancel us if we just turn to seek Him. It's as James wrote in James 4:8, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. See, if we don't sense God in our lives, it's because we've moved. It's because we have canceled God. It's because we have moved ourselves away from experiencing the intimacy that God desires. And so James writes, we draw near to God, and He will draw near to us. So let us turn to God, knowing that His love, which was demonstrated on the cross, reveals that He will not ultimately reject us, that He will not cancel us, if only we will in faith turn to Him.